Okay, let's go live.
Okay, thank you. It is now a little after 2 o'clock, and so I resume the hearing. Yeah, we do have one or two new participants along for this afternoon. I'm not going to go through the full detail that I did on opening on the first day, but suffice to say, just in terms of how we're using Zoom, can I ask, please, that people keep their cameras on, unless you don't want people to see you, in which case that's fine. You can switch them off, but my preference is to have them on, so that I'm not facing a blank screen all of the time. But also, could you generally please have your microphone switched off, apart from, of course, when it comes to your turn to speak. If at any point during the discussion you do want to come into the debate, please use your virtual hand. If you can raise your virtual hand, that would be marvellous. I can see on my screen who's raised their hands, as Ms. Vita just very briefly did there. I'm just testing the system. So I can see who's raised their hands and which order, in fact, hands have been raised as well. So hopefully, I'm just going to see how we go along. I know that most people who are joining this afternoon have been joining before, so most people should be pretty sort of familiar with the IT and the way it's working. If anyone does have any trouble as we go along, then please simply do sort of let me know, and we'll try and do what we can to help out. So okay then, matter 20. Well, are there any questions before I move to the agenda for this afternoon, which is at matter 22? I don't see any hands, so that's happy news. Matter 22 then, the supply of land for housing, and I want to, as I have in my, basically I'm using my my matters and issues paper as the agenda, so I'm simply going to go through the questions as they are set out there, and first of all, then we're going to look at the question of the overall supply of land for housing, and then when we've done that, look at the 5-year housing land supply. So first of all, then, the overall supply of land. Yeah, I wouldn't ordinarily do this, but I think this it might just sort of bear me reading out part of my matters and issues paper, which just sort of sets the scene really and gives a bit of context. So the council now proposes to reduce the overall housing requirement to 13,000 dwellings. That's 11,600 to meet Hertfordshire's housing need, and 1,400 to help address Luton's unmet housing need. This is coupled with a commitment previously put forward by the council to an early review of the local plan. The council anticipates the delivery of 14,650 dwellings over the plan period. It doesn't propose to delete from the plan any of the housing sites included within it, and argues that the difference between anticipated delivery and the requirement represents an appropriate buffer, and that's of around 13% or thereabouts of the overall housing requirement. And in arriving at that position, the council has considered a number of alternatives, and all of those are set out in its previous note, which is referenced as ED 191B. So question 22.1a, first of all then. Is reducing the overall housing requirement to 13,000 and undertaking an early review of the plan the most appropriate way forward? And if not, why not? And I think it might help, Mr. Smith, if you set out the council's stance on this to get us going.
Yep, certainly. So I can do that. Just 2 points before I start. Firstly, to acknowledge that obviously all the answers that we give in this session are predicated on the objectively assessed needs that we've discussed already, and the sites that we are yet to discuss being found sound. And I assume a number of participants, similar to a point we made yesterday, may put to you a case based on their preferred objectively assessed need or combination of sites being found sound. Just to say as an overarching point, obviously the council accepts that if you do adjust either the objectively assessed need or the site, then we would need to revisit the trajectory and potentially the overall requirement or the phasing that's put in front of you. So just to frame our answers in that context first, because I know that was a point that came up yesterday.
Yeah, and if I may, just while we're on that point, I know that obviously many participants have a different view about what the objective assessment of housing need should be. And as part of this discussion, I certainly don't want to go back, and I'm not going to go back over any of the reasons why people arrive at a different housing need figure to that the council has identified.
Okay, thank you. And the second point was we've submitted a notice there, but I know it's not yet in the examination documents about site BK3 in Barkway, which obviously is in the trajectory here. And I think for the purposes of this session, it's probably best if we just continue on the basis that that's there and part of the numbers, unless you had a different view.
Yes, it is on my to-do list to write a short note to go on the examination webpage about that. So yes, for present purposes, let us put that to one side.
Yes. Okay. In that case, I was just conscious that you read out the statement in your matters about not removing any sites and such like, and I just wanted to not confuse the issue. So yes, as you've rightly identified, we've put together paper ED 191B, which is our latest position, and in a way that builds on the paper we put in at the start of the year, ED 178, where we also looked at housing delivery. Now that earlier paper obviously predates the latest household projections, but there's some important points and principles in there, so I will refer to both. We've considered a number of possible courses of action and yes, concluded at this point in examination that reducing the housing requirement to reflect the revised objective assessed need and continuing to commit to that early review is the most appropriate way forward. I think in terms of where we've got to in the examination process, as we've shown in ED 191B and paragraphs 14 and 15 in particular, we have actually now granted permission for a significant number of the proposed allocations in the rural area beyond the Greenbelt, so sites around Royston and elsewhere, and we've proposed a number of those for deletion on the basis they've now been implemented. And in that context, I guess the examination and the extent to which we can deliver sort of really starts boiling down towards the consideration of whether exceptional circumstances exist to release land from the Greenbelt, both on a matter of principle and on a site-by-site basis. And it's obviously difficult for us to proceed without resolving that issue because, well, one, there's the lead times in permitting sites and getting them to come out of the ground. And obviously, absent a decision on the exceptional circumstances, there's a very high bar for the council to demonstrate very special circumstances to permit any of those sites in advance of you reaching those conclusions. So sort of any further delay at this stage, for whatever reason, to go and look at alternate sites or alternate strategies potentially risks us having insufficient clarity to enable those sites to proceed and just kind of pushes their determination further back in the process. As we've said throughout the examination, obviously we do not have an up-to-date plan at the moment. For decision-making purposes, we cannot demonstrate a 5-year land supply. as that's based on the standard method pending any adoption of this plan. We currently only have a 2.2-year supply, which is quite a poor position. And similarly, the council's in the bottom 10 authorities nationally under the housing delivery test. And we'll come on to discussion of the buffer and the 5-year supply in more detail, but in short, it's essential in the council's view that all the sites are retained in order to provide surety, firstly, that the objectively assessed needs can be met in full, and secondly, that the requirements of 5-year housing land supply and housing delivery test can be met both at the point of adoption and on an ongoing basis. As you say, we presented our case and suggested that we continue to meet objectively assessed need in full, but in doing so, we are also aware that the 5-year supply calculations we come on to do still remain quite tight in certain areas. We're above 5 years, but not necessarily by a lot, but that's perhaps a matter we pick up further down the line and in the conversation. So yes, the council's position in short is, as you set out, that we should reduce the housing requirement, but retain all the sites in full to ensure that we can meet that requirement over the period to 2031.
Okay, I just want to briefly check a couple of things. So the overall requirement of 13,000, as I broke down earlier, 11,600 to meet North Hertfordshire's needs.
Yeah.
So that reflects, does it then, the OAN with a small uplift, which we touched on yesterday?
Yes, correct.
And that was about C2, wasn't it?
That's right, yes. The objective assessed need was 11,500, and we just suggested an extra 100 homes on top of that, similar to the approach in the submitted plan.
Okay, and 1,400 as a contribution to Luton's unmet housing need.
Yeah.
That's a change from the submitted figure.
Yes.
Is the reason for that change simply and purely one that is about when delivery is anticipated to occur?
Correct, yeah. The 1,400 is a delivery figure. That's what we reasonably expect within the plan period. I know Mr. White for Bloor Homes in his statement has suggested perhaps they could actually accelerate above that, and we wouldn't resist that. But yeah, for the purposes of the housing requirement, which then flows into the 5-year supply figures, we think that's the most appropriate figure to use.
Okay. The early review of the plan, I know that that's something that the council has previously quite clearly committed to. Yeah. Has the council given thought as to the detail of that review and what it would encompass?
I think we've proposed now a whole plan review, effectively. At earlier stages in the examination, we had proposed focused reviews potentially on matters like retail or education, but given the sort of shortening plan period and the issues around supply and the associated challenges in ED 178, we suggested that should be a full plan review around 3 years from adoption, for several reasons. One, because we'll have a bit more certainty and detail about build-out rates from these strategic sites. At the moment you have our best estimates, but until they start coming out the ground, it's sort of difficult to precisely pin those down. And also one of the reasons we flagged was to tie ourselves in a bit more closely with the statutory review periods for both East Hertfordshire and Stevenage. Obviously we're in a shared housing market area with Stevenage. Their 5-year statutory limits are sort of late 2023 and early 2024 respectively.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. You said to tie in with Stevenage which was looking at a review at late 2023. Was that right?
Sorry, early 2024. I think it's May 2024 is Stevenage's 5-year period, obviously from an adoption in May 2019.
Right, okay. So you are then talking about a review that would happen earlier than you would statutorily be required to undertake a review. So it is genuinely an early review.
This is genuinely an early review, and just the third motive behind that, which I should have said at the outset, is obviously this plan is to 2031, which is now 11 years away, versus guidance in the MPPF that we should aim for 15 years where possible. So we're conscious that we're coming up on halfway through the plan period.
Okay, so statutorily, for goodness sake, statutorily, then you would be required to undertake a review that's after 2024. So it's 5 years from the point of adoption, isn't it?
Yes.
So that would be, well, I mean, it's what's 21.
I say 2026. But...
Isn't it? So right. So should there then in this plan be a policy mechanism requiring that review take place, or should I just take your word for it?
No, I think there should, and I think in the paper we put in, we sort of suggested that there's obviously a number of potential modifications to the plan that flow out of what we're suggesting, both in terms of proposed deletions and all the matters you've yet to hear. So we're quite happy. That's sort of a bit like something that's on your to-do list, as you said. It's on our to-do list. That yes, I think that's something that we would need to look at.
Yeah, I know that it's that is a point. There's a number of representatives and participants today, in fact, have raised, saying that there probably ought to be a policy in the plan that sort of says when and what. When and what you're going to do in terms of the review, and I have to say that given that it's before your statutory requirement for a review,
yeah.
That probably, well, frankly, that should be the case.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I would agree with that point that Mr. Smith has just made, to have that short-term review in policy within the plan. As you can see from our statement, CPRE do wish to see an early review to try to tie things together. And this point that Mr. Smith was making about the relationship between the reviews of Stevenage and East Hertfordshire is a very, very good one. If Welwyn Hatfield ever gets an adopted plan, I would like to see that included as well. And I understand that conversations have taken place between Welwyn Hatfield, Stevenage, North Hertfordshire, East Hertfordshire and Broxbourne about the possibility perhaps of doing a joint plan. A point, of course, which Mr. Bedford made earlier this morning, with I agree with that. I am very frustrated as a former structure planner and regional planner about the lack of some strategic context for plans. So I certainly would agree with all that. But I would say we won't go over it again. But because you've had all that we've got to say. But I think 11,600 is the figure suggested by Mr. Smith and yourself. We would obviously reject the 1,400 for Luton. We've made that point already. But I think also once this joint review process takes place, the great thing about it is that these plans will be brought forward and examined under the auspices of the NPPF 2019 or son of 2019, and hopefully it will all come together. The problem with it that we all have at the moment is that we're trying to examine this plan in the context of what is now an historic document of 2012, and that is the frustration. So I think that there is a requirement even in that to look at plan making using the latest information, and that's what we've tried to get across to you, sir. So yes, early review, please. Thank you, sir.
Yes, well, under the 2019 NPPF or something else.
Yes.
Mr. Parkinson.
Thank you, sir. On this topic, we agree that the housing requirements should be adjusted to reflect the OAN, whatever that's found to be. As you know, our primary concern relates to the consequent need to make supply side adjustments, which we're coming to later, so I'll hold fire on that for now. Just in terms of the review, though, we agree that needs to have the status of policy. There is text at the moment in the submitted plan that covers review. It's paragraphs 14.30 onwards. And that text refers to the possibility of a new settlement and ongoing work to explore that, and says at paragraph 14.37, we currently consider it most likely that the outcomes of these deliberations and the new settlement process will be reflected in a full review of the plan. And I just ask that in elevating what's currently in supporting text to policy, that commitment to a new settlement, which we discussed several years ago now, right at the beginning of this process, it isn't lost. And the reason why I also bring that up now is there's been a suggestion floated in some of the hearing statements that there's no purpose served by delaying adoption to remove greenbelt sites, which we'll come on to later, because North Hert's housing requirement will inevitably go up in any review. And any over provision now will be, as one party put it, readily absorbed into the review. I just want to say at this point, I think that's a very dangerous approach to take. I don't suggest that you would take it. That this plan needs to be found sound on adoption. We can't delay any issues that arise at this point and adjourn that over to a full review, which will be likely in a very different plan making context, and especially as it's set out already in the supporting text, with proposals for a new settlement which will be outside of the greenbelt. It can't be assumed that any increase in the housing requirement in North Herts will inevitably have to be accommodated through either the currently proposed greenbelt releases or additional greenbelt releases.
Yeah, you said there, Mr. Parkinson, the new settlement would be outside the greenbelt. I don't want to go far down this road at all, but would it?
So again, without wanting to go far down this road, I understand that there are, well, it's either going to be outside the greenbelt or in a more sustainable location than some of the growth villages, if I put it like that. So one site that's been mooted, for example, is north of Baldock, which is currently served by a railway station. These sorts of issues, sustainability of that location as opposed to scattered sites throughout the growth villages across the district, those are the sorts of considerations which would need to take part as any full review of the plan. And the suggestion that's been urged on you by some that, well, we don't need to worry too much and we certainly shouldn't delay adoption now because it's inevitable that similar greenbelt releases will come forward in any reviewed plan, it is one that needs to be treated with extreme caution.
Yeah, okay. I said I didn't want to go far down that road, and I put that marker down for everyone to note, because this plan doesn't include a new settlement. It's an aspiration that the council has for the future, and as such, I neither have any guarantee about where that might be, and even if I did, it's not for me to examine it. Mr. Aspinall.
Well, hello, everybody. The first thing is that, of course, I don't agree with the numbers. You know that from yesterday. But as far as the review is concerned, there are some issues coming up in the pipeline that are going to change the numbers in the methodology. And that's going to be by ministerial statement, and it could come as early as December or January. And in addition to that, of course, there's a white paper that could change the whole process. So when we talk about a review coming up in 2024, I think also this plan ought to take into account that it has to comply with any new instructions, guidelines that comes from government about numbers in the new methodology, and also in any changes in the process. Now, the reason I say that is because this local plan, working on a 2012 NPPF, is already 8 years out of date. It's certainly from its inception at the end of 2015 is 5 years out of date. And if we're going to then look to 2024, when a review is taking place, it will be then, at that point, another 3 years out of date on any new developments that might occur. So in putting into the plan that a review has got to take place in 2024, which I can understand, and don't forget, in all the government papers coming out at the moment, you've got 30 months to do it, not 5 years to do it. I'd like you to add in something in the light of, also in the light of any new government guidelines which are published in the meantime. So that would mean that, for instance, if in 2021 there is a new guideline in terms of numbers and a requirement to look at the question of sites, then that would have to be done within a 30-month period, not in a period of 3 years. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm assuming we'll come later on to talk about the question of the Sedgefield or the Liverpool scheme, so I'll come back on that later on. But if we are to understand a 5-year early review, that must take into account the fact that every year, the council is supposed to do by itself and then publish the results, the HELA, which was set out by the government in 2014. Now, I raised this 5 times at the last hearings and I never got any response from the council at all. They just ignored my comments. And that's been picked up by others in their responses that they put forward. I cannot understand why the council is not doing an annual HELA. They could do it on a desk basis and publish that result. At the moment, that is all I want to say, but I hope to have the opportunity of coming back on other points that you've raised, Mr. Barker.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr. Dorman.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. I was going to make a point about the timing with the housing planning white paper and bill coming through, but Mr. Aspinall's covered that, so I won't repeat that. I think the main point I want to say here is that the heavy overbuild in Luton, which everybody seems to be ignoring, except those of us who live in the real world, means that if there is any unmet need at all, it should first of all be applied to central beds, as I said this morning, as the most logical place to meet that need with the capacity to do so. In any event, building only 1,400 houses on this site, the East of Luton site, I realise that is the start of the process, and the expectation is that the remaining 400 or 500 will be built after the plan period ends in 2031. But I think the point I want to make is that building only 1,400 houses on that site, perhaps by 2031, is not perhaps an option, because of the clear and resolute stance taken by Herts County Council in relation to secondary school provision on this site. And I'm going to be discussing that in more depth in matter 24. It is quite key. However, the really important point in this is we do seem to have a new situation in regard to these 1,400 houses, which has been buried in paragraphs 31 and 32 of the ED 191B paper, where NHDC is now suggesting that these 1,400 houses can instead be used to provide a buffer to help ensure that NHDC delivers all the houses it needs to build for North Herts.
I'm going to ask you to pause there for a moment, Mr. Dorman, because I'm going to pick up, at the moment, I'm dealing purely with issue 22.1A, and then I'm going to go on to B and then on to C, which is where the buffer comes into it. So if you could hold those particular horses for the time being.
Yes, okay, that's fine. I think actually the only, no, that's fine. That's my points for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bolton.
Thank you. Just to tackle, there's much there I could comment on, but I'll resist. I'll just comment on the point about the early review, because reducing the housing requirement you dealt with this morning, you've heard our company's views on that. So I'm just dealing with the early review point. I mean, the context of that, however, is, if you like, by any measure, a significant undersupply of both market and affordable housing for the past decade. So we know that's the case. So an early review to make sure the plan is right going forward is clearly something that's required. Now, this isn't new for if you like, what one might call, if you like, zombie plans or the half-dead plans, carrying on from the 2012 framework. Bedford was the same. Bedford has the first policy in their plan is for an early review, and it requires an early review to be commenced within a year of adoption of the plan, because it's important to start early, and then to be submitted no later than 3 years from the adoption of the plan. It then has what I think is quite an important element to it, which says if that doesn't happen, then the plan's policies for determining planning applications for new dwellings will be out of date. So there's a very strong, if you like, requirement there for the council to comply with their own timescale. And there should be nothing wrong with that. It's their timescale, asking to deliver on their timescale, and if you like, putting their money where their mouth is, I think is more than a fair approach. The other thing I would add to that, and it wasn't relevant to Bedford, is that we have a case here where we are looking at alterations to the greenbelt boundaries for both strategic and indeed small and medium sites. Now, it is inevitable, I think, that some people who object to the plan will say, if you alter greenbelt boundaries this time, then they ought to pertain and continue, if like, beyond the length of the plan period. So, beyond 2031. I would say, well, if we are if we are recognising that the plan is short term in terms of its policies and its strategies, that any policy about review ought to have within it a statement that greenbelt boundaries may be revised at that review. Now, that revision could take place both ways. It could be for additional land to come out the greenbelt, or indeed, if things change, for sites to go back into the greenbelt. But I think it needs to be dealt with, because you can't go half and half with this. If you're going to have an early review, you've got to accept that the whole plan's up for review, and it's simply not the bits that people want to review, and try and not do the bits which are more difficult. So yes, if you are going to have a policy, if you are going to have an early review, have a policy for it, and actually have a policy that has some bite. Thank you.
Okay, well, yes, I'm grateful for your stirring of that hornet's nest, Mr. Bolton.
I thought I was being helpful, sorry.
Would that be required, do you think, for soundness as part of the main modification, introducing a review policy? And I ask that because I wonder whether, in fact, considering alterations to the green belt boundary is something that the council could do in any event.
Do you mean, could they review the greenbelt boundary in 3 years' time in any event?
Yes.
Yes, they could. However, I think if one is going for an early review because of all the reasons that's been put forward for an early review, then I think it would be worthwhile and give clarity to a future inspector sitting on a plan examination. If indeed we have plan examinations in the future, it would give them a clear indication that this was something that was discussed and not predetermined, if you like, for the next 20 or 30 years. It was still something that would be a result of a more long-term strategy for the district.
Miss Hamilton.
Okay, as things have gone on over the 5 years, I think some of us have got more and more confused. So, like, just to clarify, so we're looking at 13,000, which is 11,600 under North Herts and 1,400 under Luton at this moment in time. Okay, yes, that's correct, right? So what has that gone down in total now from what was in the plan? Because I've got figures of previously, I've got 14,650, of which 4,340 were completed, 7,700 were to be built, which made 12,040, then another 4,860 through housing allocations. So at the moment, I'm not sure whether these have got the 10% market signal uplift or the buffers or what they've got. So how much have we gone down over the whole amount type of thing? Is there an actual figure that I can make a note of?
I'm not quite sure. I'd help if I could. I'm not quite sure what you're driving at, but
I'm just wondering in its entirety, because it's saying, like, should this go down to 13,000? So what in entirety have we gone down from, and does that include this uplift and this buffer thing?
Right. Right. Okay. So the council is proposing that the housing. So you have your OAN, your needs, your identified needs. The council is proposing that, taking that needs figure for North Hertfordshire, that would equate to a requirement, a plan requirement, i.e. this is what the plan must deliver, of 11,600 to meet North Hertfordshire's housing need, and 1,400 to help address Luton's unmet need. And it's adding those two numbers together that gives you an overall local plan housing delivery requirement of 13,000.
Right.
But so far so good. But the council anticipates the actual number of houses being delivered within the plan period as being 14,650, which is clearly more than the 13,000 housing requirement in the plan.
Right. Okay. Right.
And that's so it's the difference between those two things, the 13,000 requirement and the between the I'm not sure which one it is now, and I'm quite poor.
So 1,650 basically.
But you have a larger figure, and this is how you come to this idea of there being a buffer, you see.
Right. Okay. Right. So
And
going on that.
Yeah.
So going on that.
Yeah.
Okay. And excuse my stupidity on
Not
this,
at all.
but I've got here obviously that everyone's talking about an early review. Okay. We've had 2024 come up and 2026 come up. Obviously, I've got written down that as part of this, 3,100 dwellings on the site A1M West, which is on safeguarded land, will be subject to this future early review. That's quite a large figure, 3,100. I've obviously got that out of some document from the past district council. So that seems to be quite a large amount. So I just wanted to point out that, you know, when you add all these together, there seems to be more than what's needed for a start.
Well, I think then, Ms. Hamilton, are you talking about the area of land to the west of village that's
yes.
proposed in the plan? Yeah.
Yes.
That's proposed to be, correct me if I get this wrong, but that's proposed to be safeguarded.
Yes.
And safeguarded land is land that shouldn't be developed within the plan period.
It should be the next bit.
That's right. In a way, it's sort of putting a bit of land in your back pocket for your next plan, if I can sort of describe it.
Brilliant. Right, going on all of that, and thank you for confirming that. Thank you. Can I just say, regarding this early review plan, okay, the way I see it as a normal resident person, so, you know, North Herts wants to get these sites. They don't want to reduce them or remove them. They want to push them all through. Okay. We already know from a recent meeting that, you know, they're concerned that all these different sites have obviously got little applications, and the developers are putting these applications. So obviously, if those are rejected, then appeals can be made and all this sort of malarkey. So surely, if you've got sites on significant contribution greenbelt land, okay, that are all sitting here on this local plan waiting to go in, then surely there is no way, even if there's a review, that North Herts, even if the continual trend at the moment, which is migration going down, population of North Herts going down, blah, 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 what if there was a review? There's no way they're going to turn around and go, okay, right, well, we've realised it's all going down, but there's no way we're going to remove like the one near Gravely or the one near Luton or the one near in GA2, because what's the point? We've already got them approved, so why are we now going to remove them and risk appeals and things? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense to me, and that's.
So I don't really
picking up
agree.
On a point made by, I can't remember who it was. It might have been a point actually made by Mr. Hawkins, which is, you know, once it's gone, it's gone. The review is unlikely, I would have thought, to have been about taking any of the currently proposed allocations out of the supply. Rather, it would be about looking at needs at that time, calculated, worked out on the basis of how the council would have to do it at that time, which, as we know, is, you know, that sort of formula is likely to, well, it's likely to change between now and when the council does the review, and looking at what is in the current supply, and then working out what would need to be added to that, if anything, depending on what the needs are going forward.
Okay, and more green belt stolen, basically, type of thing.
Well, that would be the choice, just as it is this time round. That would again be the choice for the council in the first instance, as part of any new plan.
Okay.
In effect, I mean, I know we're using the word review, and we're thinking of it as being a review, but in fact, what it is a new plan that will come along and supersede this one.
Okay, right. So it's yes, it's not brilliant, is it? Then basically, no. Okay, thank you.
You're asking me. I'm not sure that's for me to comment.
Okay, right. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. My understanding of the Greenbelt boundaries when they're set is that they should be enduring. We now appear to be deciding that the protection of the Greenbelt no longer exists. We already have Greenbelt land safeguarded by this local authority to the west of Stevenage, where currently Stevenage have got a planning application currently underway, and I have made points previously to your good self about the importance of sustainability of settlements that are effectively going to be developed as a result of this particular housing plan. And you know, it does make sense that in a number of ways that land to the west of Stevenage is possibly the ideal site for expanding both that town and the activities of this local authority. If we are to commit to an early review, can we extract at least an understanding that this land would likely become a factor in that particular review, given the fact that this particular local plan EIP is about how we release elements of protected land currently and what we do with them. We seem to have spent the last 2 days justifying buffers upon buffers upon buffers from the highest number of ONS numbers that exist in terms of where we're starting from. And it just keeps getting more and more incredible by the day. And I realise there are lots of people around me within this particular plan discussion that have a view as to why those additions and buffers can be continued to be added. But we have to have some reality here that we are dealing with a significant amount of greenbelt that is being torn away from the people of North Hertfordshire for the development of the North Herts District Council. I mean, 85% of their development is planned in greenbelt. So can we please just focus on the fact that are there really any extenuating or special circumstances for the release of that much greenbelt and the continuing addition of all these extra homes and so anyway, that's the point I'd like to make, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Aspinall.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. I think something was said about the review of boundaries. And if I can just remind those present that in the original local plan, there was a wording that...
My apologies, Mr. Aspinall, but we are getting a close-up of your tie, which is an admirable one.
I've changed the position of my thing here. Hold on a minute. Is that better?
There we go. Yes, that's
okay. Right. I obviously like looking at me as against my jumper. In the original local plan, there was a wording in respect of towns, and it referred to the land adjacent to the towns could be considered for building. And a number of us raised the question that we should add in in another part of the local plan, land adjacent to Category A villages. The council, in its wisdom,
yes,
decided it would take out the town and in order not to put in the subject of the Category A villages. Now, the reason I mention this is because, you know, there's a lot of complaint that goes around about builders not fulfilling their obligations of taking planning permission or getting planning permission on land, and therefore it needs to come out and others need to go in. But it's a place where you put them, and people don't want to live in the middle of a field somewhere. They want to live adjacent to some existing community. And therefore, the idea of putting those two sentences in covers a little bit of the subject of the boundaries, because it would enable. Now, we put forward, a number of us put forward, that we would accept that it would be available for consideration. That doesn't mean that it would automatically be built on, but it could be considered. And that would fulfill a little bit of flexibility in the process of this local plan of getting some of its 5-year house land supply, because you add this up and you get a number of houses, perhaps 30 houses on one site, perhaps more, perhaps less. But it would also, of course, create the employment that we need in North Hertfordshire, particularly for the small builders. And while I'm saying it, for the self-builder, of which I am one, of people, there's a large list of registered self-builders of being able to look and find houses to build. So that is the question. And regarding those houses that are in the plan that need to come out because there's no compliance, then you need to put something in their place. And the council need to take that on board. And that needs to be in the plan. Otherwise, knowing the North Herts, they will stick to whatever is written and not move away from it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to check that everyone knows that we're using my Matters and Issues paper as the agenda for today, and we are currently on the question of, is reducing the overall housing requirement to 13,000 and undertaking an early review of the local plan the most appropriate way forward? If not, why not? And that is question 22.1 A, and I will ask that everyone sticks quite rigidly to addressing that question, please. Ms. Cotier.
Yeah, I'm just going to revisit the point that was made earlier about the review timeframes. So I've just gone through and I've clarified by looking at the Luton Inspector's report if he definitely did put condition for an early review on passing of the local plan, and he absolutely did. It's indisputable. Inspector Ewell said on the 1st of August in his 2017, in his report, starting first thing he said, page 3, this report concludes that the Luton local plan provides an appropriate basis for the planning of the borough, subject to a number of main modifications being made to it. He then goes on to list them, but number one modification, first modification, is to clarify the extent of the housing market. And the second was to commit to an early review. Now, if I understood correctly, just a few moments ago, it said that the review, Mr. Wilfred Aspinall, he said that this process has to be started within 30 months. And then another, didn't get to note down his name, but another gentleman said that if it doesn't get done within 3 years, then the plan is considered out of date. So that means in 1 week, Luton's plan becomes, by that definition, out of date, because they have not done the early review that they were committed to do 3 years ago, and we're just about to go past 3 years. So does that mean we're now talking about a local plan that is considered out of date? And if so, where does that leave Mr. Bedford and his 10 points made last time? Because he talked about the enshrinement of the policies of the plan, and he said the numbers that we're discussing, certain numbers are enshrined in the local plan, statutory numbers that cannot be moved, and he gave them as his numbers. The capacity figure was one of the numbers that was enshrined, he said, as in 8,500, and the total OAN number of 17,800 was enshrined. But is it still enshrined in a local plan that's gone out of date? And furthermore, where does that leave other policies that are equally enshrined because they exist in the same plan, such as policy 4.5, which says the Luton housing capacity is 9,322. That's as enshrined as the housing capacity figure as the others, because that's a standalone figure that doesn't have a clause attached to it, whereas the others are lower estimates, and the enshrined policy clearly says that that's dependent upon not delivering student accommodation and the uncertainties around Napier and the other site, the Kenilworth site, which has been resolved. So the one we would have to go with, the most enshrined figure, would be the 4.5, in my opinion, because that didn't have a condition attached to it, whereas the other lower figure had conditions attached to it that have since been resolved. But that doesn't help us if the whole thing is out of date anyway, because it's gone past the review. So are we dealing with a plan that is considered out of date now? Are we talking about something that's
I don't quite know what happened then. Can I just check?
Can you not hear me now? What went wrong? Something go wrong?
Yeah, only just at the tail end there.
Okay, so you got most of it. Just the part probably at the end where I said, "Are we dealing with?" Let me just double check. Did you get the part about the policy 4.5 giving the figure as 9,322? Did you get to that bit? Because that is probably the main takeaway point from all of what I just said. But that doesn't have any conditions attached to it. I think you heard that as well. However, the last part I said was, are we dealing with a plan that is out of date now? According to the definitions given by the experts earlier, we would be, because no review has been undertaken, early review has been undertaken, and we've gone past the time frame that was required for the plan to be considered in date. And since we've gone past it it was adopted in November 2017, and we're 1 week away from the end of November. So in 1 week, it would be out of date. And unless they're going to do a review in 1 week, we're out of date next week. And where does that leave our enshrinement of these enshrined policies? Does it make them a little bit more flexible now that they're out of date? Or are we still going to say that they're enshrined and they're enshrined upon a robust basis? Because a robust basis can't be out of date.
Yeah, I understand the point. Okay, thank you. Ms. Solander.
Hi, yeah, hopefully it's a quick point. I've understood now, looking at Luton's going down to 1,400, that the reason for that difference between the 2,000 from earlier is the 615 houses that are going to be built beyond the planned period. There's also 1,825 homes to be built beyond the planned period now in the North Hart section. Now, if they're all on green belt, these houses. So I just really would like some clarity. Does that mean that really those bits of land aren't being released, can't be considered as being available for development because they're outside the planned period? And really we should just lower all the sites, you know, so actually it all starts to make sense, because they're not in the buffer. And I just want to get clarity whether that's a 1,300.
Yeah, if I could just ask you to hold that point, that's really more for B and or C.
Okay, I'll come back then.
Questions.
Thanks.
Mr. Beglin.
Well, so good afternoon, and apologies in advance because I'm going to be departing against your strict instruction, but very briefly, I hope, against keeping on this one question, but it's in a very short response to what Ms. Cottier just said, and just so that you have the references. Mr. Bedford spoke before lunch about some elements of the Luton local plan that might be of assistance for you to see. Bearing in mind the references that we just had to the review policy itself, it strikes us that it may be of assistance for you to see that as well. And for others who already have access to the document, the review policy is policy 40. At pages 112 and 113. And one of the reasons that we would invite you to look at that and to see the justification and reasons for the review policy was that it echoes what Ms. Barker was telling you before lunch. And it's essentially that the reason for the review policy was so that the ramifications of the growth option study and how North Herts and Central Bedfordshire could take their plan processes through and assist Luton would then inform the further review of the Luton local plan. And that's set out in black and white in the text of policy 40. So if we can supply that to you as well, that may assist you in understanding the chronology as Inspector Ewell saw it then. And just as it were, while I've got the microphone, in relation to the various points that have been made about the white paper, you will of course be well familiar with the guidance that is emerging consistently from government about the white paper not being a reason for the delay of plans. In fact, the constant steer is there for plans to be taken through to their adoption where that's appropriate because they can meet the tests of soundness. Just going back to LP 40 very, very quickly as well, because I think Mr. Bolton may have been misunderstood earlier. I think he had his hand up, but his reference to the review policy that had a specific requirement for a review after 3 years was, I think, to the Bedford review policy and not ours. There's no equivalent in the Luton policy. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd noted that as Bedford. Yeah, Mr. Smith. Do you want to come back on the points that we have just heard? I'm particularly intrigued to know what you think of the idea of your review policy, saying something about whether your policies would be out of date if you didn't submit your plan on time, which was one suggestion.
Yes, I imagine we probably wouldn't want anything quite that firm. When it was suggested, I was possibly going to pass the buck to you, sir, and to say, obviously, we're happy to draft some modifications, but obviously it's for you to determine whether they pass muster and they cover the ground you want them to. Yes, I don't think I'd want to commit the council at this point to say, yes, if we don't do it, then our whole plan is out of date.
Yeah, okay. I thought you might say that. And on the other points that we've heard.
Yeah, as you suggested, we did range off the question at hand a bit, but I'll just pick up on a couple, just because I think it's helpful to pick them up now. Mr. Dorman suggested that the east of Luton sites now sort of effectively formed part of the buffer of sites that we were proposing. Just to state that that is incorrect, and that is quite clearly set out in paragraph 24 of ED 191B, where we show that both the target for Luton's unmet need is 1,400 homes, and the anticipated delivery for Luton's unmet needs in that period is 1,400 homes. The buffer very much comes from the other sites within North Hertfordshire. This is the first point. And the second, although it's slightly tangential, I guess, just to address Mr. Aspinall's point about the lack of updated housing assessments, because he says it's been raised a number of times. So I think in fairness to him, if I just clarify that, we did do annual or very near annual assessments all throughout the period running up to the submission of this plan. And we went through all that at quite great length when we did the original hearings. I think, so you asked us for a kind of a timeline of all those studies and how the sites had come into being. The reason there haven't been any recently is that we effectively stopped doing those updates at the point we submitted the plan, because obviously at that point, that is the evidence that supports the plan we're putting forward, and it's for the inspector to direct at that point if the evidence we've put forward is unsatisfactory and requires an update. I would imagine that once this process is complete, we would go back to that process of doing far more regular updates in terms of looking at sites and opportunities, because obviously that becomes a critical part of informing the next review. And on the other points, I think, well, you picked up the point that Ms. Hamilton raised, just questioning about reviews. As you say, a review is effectively a whole new plan. It is termed a review, but it's not a case of us sort of marking this plan as a B+ or a D-. It's not reviewing it in that sense. It is coming up with a new plan that rolls us forwards. And just noted Mr. Hawkins' point on buffers, but obviously your questions do kind of lead us through both in the matters this morning and the matters we've got this afternoon, and what the individual justification is for each of those steps. Obviously the council is satisfied that each of those steps is sound, and that's ultimately for you to come to a view on, sir. I see Ms. Ormsby's got her hand up, so I'm not sure if she wanted to add to what I've said.
Yes, I wonder if Mr. Bolton might be very gentlemanly and just hold on for a moment while we let Mr. Smith take some friendly fire off Miss Ormsby.
Well, thank you, sir. It was really just to deal with this review point and out of date point. I'm sure I'm only telling you something that you already know, but if there is a review mechanism put in the plan which says there shall be a review undertaken by a certain period, and that is not complied with, that would not, of course, as you will well know, not render the remainder of the policies in the plan out of date. What would then happen is that those policies would have to be tested as against the MPPF to see how consistent they are, which would that fact would then determine whether or not those policies are out of date. It wouldn't relate back to the review mechanism, which would somehow render the whole policies in all the plan out of date. I'm sure you already know that, but just as a point of clarification.
Thank you. And despite the current order, Mr. Bolton was next, but in a gentlemanly fashion stood aside. Mr. Bolton.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points of clarification. Mr. Bagelin was absolutely correct. What I was referring to was the Bedford Local Plan Policy, Policy 1. That does not say that all policies are out of date. I quite clearly didn't say that. What it says is policies relating to the supply of housing, I think is the correct terminology, will be deemed to be out of date. So it's a slightly different and a more limited impact than what is being suggested by others. That was obviously found to be sound and found to be a main modification that was required to be put into the plan in order for the plan to be sound.
So obviously, I haven't seen this policy, but as from your description, I understand the workings of that mechanism to, in effect, kick in the presumption in favour of sustainable development earlier than it otherwise would. Is that right?
Yes, it results in the most important policies for determining applications for new dwellings to be deemed out of date. Effectively, I can provide you with a copy of the policy. No problem at all, sir, if that would be of help to you.
It would potentially be helpful.
At least you'll know what I'm talking about then, won't you?
Well, absolutely. It would clear that up in my mind for sure. So if you wouldn't mind passing that through Mrs. St. John Howe, Mr. Bolton, I'd be grateful.
No problem at all, sir.
I can see that there are a few other hands up. Can I just ask Ms. Cotier, because you're next, whether it's a short point, and I ask just because I'm looking to take a break now. If it's a longer point, then I'll take the break immediately. If it's a short one, I'll hear you now.
I think it's reasonably short, so I think you can hear it now if you want.
Okay.
Okay. So just getting up the previous things. Yeah. So I want to go back to the point that Mr. Aspinall made about the housing and economic land availability assessment, because in my mind that feeds directly, well, the result of not having done that is what is creating what we're saying is an unmet need, or in the case of North Hertfordshire, demand upon sites which are on the green belt, because the claim is being made there's nowhere else we can put these houses. We've got this figure and there's nowhere else we can put them. So that's it, how it feeds into those two parts of this discussion. So when Wilfred Aspinall first requested this, goes right back to, as far he may have requested it even earlier than this, but at least to matter 11 in his hearing statement for week 6, back in the 8th of February 2018, he requested that a housing and economic land assessment be provided, and he asked for it again in a later matter 6 deliverability statement. And then I began to echo his concerns when I realized the importance of having this register of land that is complete, comprehensive, transparent and thorough. It's not a call for land, and that's what I think has happened. And we had this clarified by Mr. Nigel Smith a couple of months ago when we asked, did the council make a register or merely put out a call for land sites, and then from the call of land site, from the response that they got from their call for land sites, compile a list? And the reply came back that it was them coming forward to the council, not the council comprehensively listing the land that was available. And the absence of this is affecting everything. And I myself asked that this process be undertaken, and the assessment is supposed to relate to the plan process, and it should be also carried out on an annual basis. So for every year that's gone by without it, there's been a lack of information to say anything other than the list of initially put forward sites, and that's not what the PPG in paragraphs. I'll find the actual PPG. I mean, it gives a very comprehensive body of guidance as to what the role of this HELAR is supposed to be. I'm sure you've looked it up many times, but just in case other people want to know, PPG paragraphs 001 goes into what the purpose of the land availability assessment is, and it says it's an important source of evidence to inform plan making and decision taking and the identification of a 5-year supply of housing land, and it can also inform as well as make use of sites in brownfield registers. Now, this is very important in relation to the 1,400 figure or the larger 2,100 figure that is apparently going to go beyond the plan period, because the brownfield registers are extensive, and yet they have, well, at least in the they are fairly large as well in North Hertfordshire, but in Luton they are extensive, and there is in the plan as well as the MPPF requirement that the borough where the housing need, the location where the housing need arises is the best place to fulfill that need. So if there are many sites available that are being ignored or willfully left out because there is an avoidance of making a comprehensive register of all the land available, then of course we're going to have a shortfall or an unmet need, as it's being called. But is it truly an unmet need, or is it just a lot of land sites being hidden behind a screen? And that screen is the absence of the HELA. And I'm suggesting there is no deficit of land sites within Luton's own boundaries. We have found many. In fact, we began to undertake we began to cobble together something of what might be said to resemble a HELA ourselves, because it wasn't being done in spite of us repeatedly asking for it. So I thought to myself, what we all thought together, what would we be putting in this register of land sites? Well, of course, we put in all the empty commercial properties would go in it, all the brownfield registers, any other brownfield sites that are not being used, everything in the SHLA, which is a minute fraction of the total land available. So if we'd have had the HELA at the beginning, as Mr. Aspinall requested, and then I echoed those requests, and he requested, and I requested, and so on. And he's right when he says his requests have been ignored, because so have mine on this. It's a real integral matter. So if people want to go and look at paragraphs 001, and then also 002, 003, 004, it carries on. I mean, there's 00 all the way down to 010. So from PPG paragraphs 001 right down to 010, it tells you everything about this housing economic land availability assessment. And no, it isn't a SHLA. It's not, it's different. It's the stage that should be undertaken prior to the SHLA. The SHLA is evaluating what benefits one site might have against another, whereas the HELA is merely a register of everything that could be considered. It doesn't say whether it's going to be developed or not. It simply is there, it exists, and it's this size. And then it will say whether it's brownfield, or whether it's greenbelt or agricultural, or whatever it is, green space, empty commercial. But we would have that all as one list, and I have tried to do something that does resemble that in my appendices.
Okay, I'm going to hold you there because I really need to take a break. So I'm going to take that break, and then when we come back, I'm going to hear any final points on question 22.1a. And then move on to 22.1b and possibly C as well. Okay, so I make it 3:22. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:45. Thank you. Right, okay, it is now 3:45, and so I resume the hearing. Hopefully we're all back, although I can't be absolutely certain of that. Just before we pick up where we left off, just a couple of housekeeping and procedural points. It's been brought to my attention that in the previous session there was some gesturing going on, which I didn't notice or pick up on. Yes, look, please don't do that. I don't want any gesturing or other gesticulation going on. Also as well, can I remind people of the need to stick to the questions that are on the agenda, please. A heads up, I'm going to finish at 4:30 or thereabouts today, and I do want to make progress before then, so please try and keep responses as concise, as focused as they can be. Cotier, we were with you when we took our break. I think I cut you off at that point. Yeah, you are there. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I have your point about the HELAR, and if you wanted to move on from that, I would be grateful.
Yeah, thank you.
Ms. Cotier.
Thank you. Yeah, so, I want to just correct something I said prior to the break, that the PPG paragraphs, I checked exactly what the numbers were, and it was 001 to 0027, sorry, 001 to 027 in the PPG. That's where the HELAR and what each stage of it is described. And there's 5 stages in total to it. And the stage 1 is the identification of the sites and broad locations. So that's the list, that's for all intents and purposes a directory or a list. And then stage 2 is the broad location assessment. And that's where you might choose, for example, some of the responses that you got from your call for sites. You'll get a criteria and you'll start looking at each possible site against that criteria. But that's stage 2. Stage 1 is the actual identification of sites, and then stage 3 is the windfall assessment. Stage 4.
Just to assist Ms. Cotier, yeah. If you bear in mind that you're addressing me, and I'm
sorry, what I'm doing is I'm trying to read from a screen at the same time as speaking.
Okay. No, I don't mean that. What I mean to say is you don't need to tell me what the PPG says about the HELAR, because I know that well.
Brilliant. Okay, it's good to have that confirmed, because to be honest, I was wondering whether anyone had heard of it, because we had brought it up, but we weren't clear whether or not what's happening with it. Are we going to get one? And even if we don't get one for this plan, we'd be needing one for, if we're talking about a review already, we'd be needing it for then. So anyway, that was the end of that. And I don't think I was going to put my hand up immediately to speak on the new point. I was going to wait and listen for a little while. So I think I'm finished for now, and I'll.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Aspinall.
Well, mine's going to be very brief. I'm challenging Mr. Smith. The SHLAA was done in a complete rush. A lot of people missed the deadline date. A lot of sites were not put into it. And that's where the HELAR comes into it, in terms of setting a list of all the sites that are available.
You'll forgive me. I know, Mr. Aspinall, but
yeah, but I'm leading up to something.
If you forgive me, can you tell me how this relates to question or issue 22.1A?
Well, I'm just continuing it on what Mrs. Cotier has said.
Yeah, I know,
and perhaps that wasn't either.
And I said to Ms. Cottier that I've had her point about the HELAR. We discussed the HELAR at significant length at previous hearings as well, as Ms. Cottier pointed out. The HELAR is not what I'm talking about now under issue 22.1a, which is what we are talking about, unless there is a very, very clear link between the two. I have to say I can't see it.
Well, the HELAR is fundamental. Green belts, public domain, appeals, you name it, is there. Once again, we are not getting our message over, Mr. Barclay, not getting our message over to the council, and they need to take it on board. I'll finish at that. You clearly don't want to hear what I've got to say.
Not on the HELAR at this point. Ms. Hamilton.
I'll keep this short to one sentence. I think this is very quick. I think based on what Mr. Aspinall and Ms. Costier were saying was that I think the reason they tried to put it in as to link it in with A was the whole thing of reducing the housing numbers, and maybe we wouldn't have been in this position if asking for brownfield registers and HELARs hadn't been the main thing from 2017 and 18. I think what they might have been saying is if they had been in place, we wouldn't have so many sites on Greenbelt and still be in this fighting this local plan now. That's all I just wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, Ms. Hamilton, Mr. Aspinall, and others who I hope are listening. Ms. Cottier did make that point, and as I said to Ms. Cottier, I heard and I understood her point. You know, it's not lost on me. Ms. Ormsby.
Well, thank you, sir. It was just to come back to the point that was discussed before the coffee break in relation to the nature of the review policy. And you'll recall that Mr. Bolton referred to policy 1 of the Bedford local plan, which sets out a pretty draconian review policy. And it's just to say this, I think the council will be very concerned if you were minded to adopt a policy in the same terms. I'm happy to deal with that now if that would help, but it might be better if you have a look at the policy, and then if you want us to respond in relation to our position on that, then we're more than happy to do that if you were in any way attracted to it. And if you're not, then we'll just leave it there. But if you look at it and think, well, actually, I quite like the idea of that, then I think we really would want an opportunity to respond to you on that point. Yeah. Probably not helpful to take any more time up with it now, but have a look, see what you think, and just to put down a marker that we'd actually want to make some reps to you about it if you're attracted to it.
Yeah, I mean, two things on that. The first being, I suppose, is that I'm at a bit of a disadvantage in that. My apologies, I was just distracted by something else on my screen. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I haven't seen that policy yet.
Exactly.
The other thing to say is that I would anticipate the normal sort of procedure in terms of drafting that particular main modification, in that I'd expect the council to propose something to me first, and then if I thought that it needed to be altered in some way, then there would be that sort of debate to be had, if you like.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Beglan.
So just very briefly on the proposed reduction that is embedded within the 13,000 figure insofar as it relates to the east of Luton, and you will have seen our hearing statement on that. I don't know if it's a convenient time for me to make three very short points in relation to that. The first is that we understand why the figure has moved down from 1,950 to 1,500 as a result you were told earlier, relating to the practical ability to deliver within the planned period. And so insofar as the test before you is, you should be making such changes as you consider are necessary to make the plan sound, then we see the basis for that adjustment. As you know from our hearing statement, what we don't see is the basis applying the same test for a further adjustment down from 1,500 to 1,400. So we say that that would not be a further change that would fall within, as it were, your jurisdiction in relation to the main modifications. But if you took a contrary view in relation to that, we'd say it's also contrary to the overall merits of the proposed submission version of the plan, which of course in SP8 contains the provision for making a contribution to our unmet needs of 1,950 units. That's SP8 as drafted. And then the third and final point we'd make about this is, of course, we're going to come on to talk about the buffer. There's no buffer in relation to Luton's unmet needs, but insofar as there will now be a buffer as proposed in the order of 13%, then we say that that, in terms of soundness, it is where any further need to find those additional 100 homes that are the difference between us should be found. Thank you very much.
Ms. Ormsby, a legacy hand.
Yes, I think that's the hand as a
Mr.
legacy
Bolton.
hand, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bolton.
All I was going to say is the policy's been sent through to you, sir. Louise has got it, so you can look at it at your leisure and take a view.
Okay, thank you. People do seem to have a strange idea of what I like to do in my leisure time. Ms. Cottier.
Yeah, no feeling. Right, so this question here about how should the supply of housing sites be reduced if the plan should be the total should be lowered to 13,000. Well, wouldn't it be sensible to perhaps look at the most contentious sites? That's one idea, or to look at the most the sites that are making the highest contribution to the green belt would be another place to start, or maybe sites that have incompatible development going on, either slightly upon them or next door to them, or even fairly close by to them. So those three starting points could be a beginning of an answer to that question, because not all of the sites are presenting the same level of problem. Not all of the sites are as problematic as the others. So some are standing out as becoming have difficulties attached to them, whereas others are looking like there's not so much resistance against them. The communities might want them, whereas other places the communities definitely do not want them. The only people that want them are the developers and perhaps the councils. So how are we going to all come to an agreement? Is it going to be a case of we're going to be dragged kicking and screaming, and we're forcing these sites onto us even though we don't want them, or are we going to come to some grown-up agreement? Or we've been talking for a really long time about this, years, which we're running into years now, and even now we're so far away from reaching common ground collectively that we're talking about, oh, well, maybe an early review might kick the can down the road further for a little bit longer, and we can just, deal with the problems later. Just anything, just get it through. But if we've spent this much time and money, all of us have spent a lot of time and money on this, trying to come to some agreement. If I'm buying something, I expect it to last me into the long term. I don't want to just buy something that's going to not last me or not be durable. We should get our full 5 years worth of wear out of this plan after having spent so much time discussing it. And I don't think that the communities understand that there needs to be some type of plan in place. I think there's been, you know, we've moved from really not wanting perhaps a plan. Well, some of us weren't perhaps clear how important it was to have one in place at the beginning, but we understand it's important to have one in place. But I don't think that there has to be some give and take on perhaps both sides as well, in order to meet some kind of common ground. Otherwise, this idea of, well, we have to get it through, and so we might risk some kind of legal action from the developers, so let's just keep the figures as they are, don't challenge anything. This kind of rationale is forgetting that you could equally meet legal action on the other side, when the really angry communities don't feel like they haven't been treated fairly either. So you could equally meet delays on the other side as well. So wouldn't it be better now to just take stock? Well, people have different ideas about this, so it's not so easier said than done, but to take stock of the least sustainable sites, because there's a presumption towards sustainability always. That could be economic sustainability, or it could be environmental sustainability. So there might be some sites that are not environmentally sustainable, but they seem to be economically sustainable. So they're attractive perhaps to one party, but not to the other party. And some sites are bad in both ways. They are not economically sustainable, because perhaps they're going on next to incompatible development that is then going to be constrained, that is more valuable than perhaps another, the residential development, or it's also not environmentally sustainable. And also this could also come into the contribution that the Greenbelt is making, whether it's significant or moderate. So to me, I think the thing I would look for, this is my answer to this question, and I'm, to be honest, getting quite tired now, so I'm probably going to sit back for the rest of the session. So probably everyone will be quite glad they won't hear from me very much more for the rest of the day. But I just want to finish off by really saying that the sites that are the most contentious and present the most problems is a good starting point. The least economically sustainable, the least environmentally sustainable, and the ones making the highest contribution to the Greenbelt. If we can come to some kind of agreement on the figures now at this stage, and people just can say they feel they've more or less gotten what they wanted, that will remove any type of delay that might be meeting us around the corner in terms of the legal challenges, which is going to delay it even further and cost yet more money, more time, more agony. But that would be where I would start, and that's my answer to that question, because it seems logical to me.
Thank you for that, Ms. Cotier. Ms. Cotier has, to my mind, moved us on to the next two questions at B and C. I don't know if others who have raised their hand are still on A. I'll assume that that you are for now. Ms. Sunanda, you're not?
No, I was hoping we were moving on, because I'm not in tomorrow, and I'd really like to move to B if we can.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to do that. If there are a few comments left on A in the hands that are currently up, I will take them, but I will otherwise move on to basically what I'm going to do is consider B and C together, because they are so closely interlinked, I think. So those are issues 22.1 B and C. If the housing requirement should be modified to 13,000 dwellings, should the supply of housing sites proposed in the plan also be reduced, and if so, how? And that was the sort of thing that Ms. Cotier was just talking about. And is a buffer of around 13% an appropriate approach? If not, why not? And yeah, sorry, I've forgotten who I've got now. Miss Sonnender.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, there's a few points I want to make under this one. First, the point that I sort of tried to make under A, but is really B, which is what about the 1,825 houses for North Herts and 615 in Luton that are actually outside the plan period now? They're still in the plan. But really, should they be removed because they're not going to be built before the end of the plan period? Because otherwise, they're like an addition to the buffer beyond the buffer being there. And I suppose what I'd like to say is I think they should be removed, particularly as they're on greenbelt sites, and that's a decision for the ongoing local plan, whether these developments, which are extension, they're not like a new town, they're extensions to the town, to the town. I'd like to see them removed. That's my point on that one. My concern with leaving a huge buffer and all the sites in is that the greenfield sites are very likely to get developed in preference to the brownfield site, which is against national policy. So actually keeping such a huge buffer in, I think is really going to mean we're going to lose our green belt while we have brownfield sites in need of sort of uplifting that are just going to get ignored. For the period to date, I think we've seen about 2.4% non-development of the planned sites. So a buffer of 2.4% has actually been what's been needed up till now, looking at the data in EDB 191B. So I would suggest that anything above 2.4% is just putting at risk sort of greenfield sites to brownfield and stopping us actually, perhaps saving a bit of greenfield. In terms of the numbers we've seen, we've got a gap of 1,671, I think, between what the housing sites in there, assuming we save the 1,825, we've got at least 1,600 that you could save off the green belt. That's a few sites that could be removed from the plan, and we'd like to see those sites removed from the plan. In terms of how we do it, you could say it's going to be a long, tortuous process, but I would say that ED 172 and LP4 contain sustainability assessments for all the sites in these plans. There was a process used to decide who stayed in and who stayed out to begin with. All we have to do now is take the next least sustainable sites off those, using the same methodology. That's consistent, it's in practice, the sites have already been assessed. So it should be a relatively quick process, as far as I can tell, to remove sites. It'd be much more tricky to put them back in. But that's how I currently see it. And if in 3 years' time, we find suddenly we're short of houses, as seems unlikely given we're going for all the high-end scenarios, but it seems unlikely, then actually these sites are still there to consider. But at the moment, that's my suggestion on how we remove the sites, and also that we'd like to see the sites out that are going beyond the plan period. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Vita.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to go back to what Ms. Cossier was saying, really, and we fully support the issue of looking for the most unsustainable sites to remove, if indeed we are going to remove some sites, and that's what we would like to see. I also wanted to refer to Nigel Smith's comment at the beginning, and I'm basically here representing Barkway, and we were aware that Nigel had written to you, sir, asking to consider the removal of BK3, which is the site in Barkway, from the plan. So I would also like to say we support what North Herts are saying. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the wording, despite trying to get hold of it and having failed.
So look, that's something that hit very late last week. So I specifically don't want to, I've heard what you said now, but I specifically don't want to talk about that today. That there will need to be a separate hearing session on that.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that was my main point, but I just wanted to say in favour of removing sites where local communities are working really hard to provide what they need for their community. So Barkway has a neighbourhood plan that's just gone through its regulation 14 stage, and we're hoping to submit as soon as we can after your report. And the neighbourhood plan looks at infill sites, redevelopment, design, etc., but does not support the release of BK3. And we've done a housing needs survey. There's only 18 affordable housing units needed. They can be provided within what we expect to come forward in Barkway without this site. And it worries us that there's a planning application sitting with North Herts. It's been there for a very long time. And if the site wasn't to be...
I don't want to talk about BK3.
Okay.
Not today. I don't mean ever.
No.
But as I say, yeah, a separate discussion will need to be arranged about that.
Okay. So finally, the most unsustainable sites should be looked at, whether they be greenbelt or potentially not greenbelt. They could be sites around little villages. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vita. Mr. Smith, I haven't given you the opportunity to reply for some time. How are you feeling about that? I don't want you feeling left out.
No, that's fine. Yes, obviously on these questions of B and C, obviously in short, the council's position is that for the reasons we've set out in ED 191B, well, firstly, that it's necessary and justified to retain the sites in full and that the buffer is justified. So it's probably best if you finish going around the other parties who, on the whole, I imagine will have a contrary view to that, and we can address those points insofar as we can at the end of that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Griffiths. You're muted, Mr. Griffiths. There we go.
We all right? Good. Yes, going on with that point, I mean, it's set out in paragraph 27 of the ED 191B. It's argued we've got a robust approach, flexibility and greater certainty. I would say, for the words flexibility, convenience for the council to have that buffer. It goes on to talk about the impact of COVID, uncertainties, and we've rehearsed those yesterday. Uncertainty of the construction industry, delivery of housing, and they believe that if we have constraint too close to the housing requirement, you've got a problem with the 5-year housing supply and the housing delivery test requirements. Fine, but I think they've also proposed having a review of the plan in the short term. Now, it seems to me that if we accept that, there is no need then for the 13% buffer that they've got in the plan, that things can move on, things can be reconsidered in a quite a short period of time. So that's really why we would suggest that 13% is really not appropriate. Thank you.
Mr. Berend.
Thank you, sir. Been waiting a while to have first say today, but in terms of our position, sorry.
I say thank you for your patience.
In terms of our position, it's okay, sir. It's okay, sir. In terms of our position, is that we broadly support where the council's coming from in terms of having a buffer. We do not think the supply should be reduced. I think there's a number of points with regard to that. I think firstly is that it will slow down the delivery of this plan. This has been an examination for a number of years now, and the plan needs to come forward, and further delay it can't be countenanced. So I think this is important that we move forward with the plan. But the second point really is about actually maintaining that supply to ensure sufficient flexibility. And this really comes back to paragraph 14 of the NPPF, and ensuring that you have flexibility with your plan to address uncertainty and potential change in your plan period. We have a relatively short period remaining within this plan. It's less than the 15-year minimum that would be expected in a plan going forward. So you don't have the time to address that. especially when you look at in terms of you're minorising the risks in terms of the delays to delivery on strategic sites, because that's where your risk happens in terms of where you might be less than expected in terms of delivery or delivery being delayed. So you're having to base your buffer with regard to the risks related to the sites that are coming forward and what is the type of delivery. And looking at it, there's 7 sites, about over 450 in this plan. It's around about 50%, about half of all planned delivery for the remaining period of the plan. So that's quite a significant amount. So there is significant risk within that supply there. So actually having a reasonable buffer is very important. You know, we would argue that 13% is probably not sufficient, and actually it should be higher than that in terms of moving forward with the plan. But definitely there is a need for that flexibility and buffer. I think the other element is that it's very difficult to predict supply, both in the short term and in the long term. And I think having that flexibility really supports the robustness of that plan and making sure that needs are met in full, which I think is a clear and important and a clear and important element of the soundness of this plan, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Hamilton.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So B. Yes. I and the people that I am speaking on behalf of believe that it should be modified. First of all, this should be done, so basically step 1, this should be done by recognising the most controversial sites. So basically that would be those offering a significant contribution to the Greenbelt purposes, which is obviously in line with NPPF and the government, you know, targets, etc., etc. And we believe that these should ideally be removed from the plan. Step 2, we would then look at the sites with the most environmental impact and where sustainability is questioned. These should then be considered in regards to being reduced, as obviously sustainable development is meeting the diverse needs of people in the existing communities, and it continues to promote well-being of that community, and that's quite an important thing. So in regards to question C, which is the buffers, I have got written down here, the buffer previously was 6%, then 7%, then it went down to 4%, then back to 6%. But due to the current economic climate, it has been increased to 13% or 14%, depending on which paragraph you're looking at, because in one of the recent documents, I had seen mention of 13% and 14%.
Yeah, I think that was as a result of a bit of rounding here and there, I think.
Yeah.
I've seen that.
As it provides certainty that the housing requirement can be met, and it can demonstrate a 5-year land supply, even though it has already been established that NHDC can't actually manage to build the housing requirement as it stands, and even if it was to be reduced, they would have difficulty building that, even if it was reduced in line with the 2018 ONS. So increasing it from like the 6% to the 13% seems absolutely ludicrous. Surely keep it at the lower amount that would definitely like see sites being reduced or removed, and then we can actually move on and get this plan approved without like further talks of like appeals and JRs and all sorts of malarkey that I'm sure nobody really wants. You don't want it, we don't want it, we're sick of it, to be quite frankly honest. I mean, we've had nightmares about this. So we support Stephen McPartland and the other people that have made submissions in that it should be reduced to reflect a deliverable plan. And yes, please, we believe removing significant contribution sites and reducing those with environmental constraints and not sustainable. Thank you, Inspector.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Mr. Parkinson.
Thank you, sir. So in terms of 22.1b, our answer is yes, the supply of housing sites should also be reduced. And the reason for that is we do not think that the size of buffer is appropriate. And the reason for that is that with a buffer of that size, exceptional circumstances don't exist for the release of land from the green belt, certainly in the growth villages. So that does slightly blend your questions C and D. So unless you're happy for me to do that, I'll try and limit myself to C. In terms of the justification for the buffer, it said that it's needed to ensure sufficient flexibility in accordance with paragraph 14 of the NPPF. And there's no dispute from us that some form of buffer is sensible to ensure that the housing requirements met. But the issue here is that the submitted plan had a buffer of 6%. And the question we suggest for you is not whether a buffer in principle is appropriate, but the size of that buffer, and whether, in effect, doubling the size of that buffer is justified. What's the evidence that sits behind it? And as far as we can see, it's contained in 6 short paragraphs in ED 191b. And as I've said, it boils down to the need for certainty that the housing requirement will be met. But when the plan was submitted, the council was confident that a 6% buffer would do that job. What's changed? Reference being made to COVID, and clearly that's going to have an impact, at least in the short term. But point one is that's already factored into the trajectory, and you can see in the same paper the adjustments that the council has made to accommodate that at paragraphs 12 and 13. But in terms of the growth villages and the allocations there, they don't come on stream until 2022-23, and the majority are going to be built out between 2024 and 26, which is almost 4 years away, and which is another lifetime. But putting all of that to one side, even if you removed all of the growth villages and the allocations, greenbelt allocations in the growth villages, the council would still have a surplus against its housing requirement in all bar 2 years at the end of the plan period. And it's already forecasting a shortfall against one of those years in any event the last year of the plan. In the remaining years, based on our calculations from the trajectory, if you removed all of the growth villages, the buffer against the requirement would fluctuate year by year from 7% to 95% to 2 to 8 to 16 to 10 to 4. So all within the range of buffers considered appropriate at various stages in the lifetime of this plan. So for those reasons, we say that the size of the buffer doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's also striking, and it does raise a question of legal compliance, that it doesn't appear to have been any assessment that we can see of the environmental, social and economic effects of different buffer sizes through the SA process, or of any reasonable alternatives, bar the do-nothing approach adopted of maintaining the housing supply. In terms of how we deal with this, we say for those reasons, and linking it into exceptional circumstances, which we'll do tomorrow, that what's currently proposed before you is unsound. In terms of how to deal with that, we say, and I'll come on to it tomorrow, that the allocations around the growth villages should be removed. But ultimately, how to correct unsoundness is a matter for the council. And at the very least, what they would have to do is carry out that assessment I just set out of the environmental, socio-economic effects of different buffer sizes to work out what an appropriate buffer would be. And just picking up on the point made by the HBF and also by the council, yes, that's going to result in a delay. And yes, North Herts want an adopted plan, so do we. Recognise the difficulties in responding to a moving feast in terms of housing projections and the like. And this examination has been a long and arduous process. But if this version of the plan had been submitted at the beginning, where more land is being supplied than is needed to meet the OAN, with this extent of reasoning in support, those 6, and I think we said in our hearing statement, they consisted of fairly bland platitudes. Those 6 paragraphs in that one paper, it wouldn't have passed go. And that should be no different at the end of the process. And when we talk about the buffer, it's important to remember it's not a number, it's made up of allocations. And those allocations are now in effect legacy allocations. They're a relic from a time when North Herts was planning to a higher housing requirement. And the justification for those allocations needs to be rigorously analysed. And without that assessment of the effects of different buffer sizes, you can't be satisfied that a buffer of this size is justified, as opposed to a buffer of 8% or 6%.
Thank you, Mr. Parkinson. Mr. Bolton, is it a reasonably short point? I'm only asking because I'm looking to adjourn for the day shortly.
No, it won't be that short. It'll be about 5 minutes or so, sir.
No, I'm sure you can make it 4, Mr. Bolton.
Okay, I'll make it 4 minutes. Put the stopwatch on. Okay. Firstly, the 2012 NPPF requires plans to be flexible. That's on the test of soundness in paragraph 14A, and that's to respond to, if you like, changes. Now, those changes could be increases in housing requirement or decreases. So there is justification, if you like, to look for a buffer. What we would say is, leading on to what you might be looking at next in terms of 5-year land supply, under very few scenarios are there going to be a 5-year land supply against any assessment of housing need which we have at present. Now, that would suggest that if you were to keep, and we're looking at an early review, so it suggests if you are to keep sites in, the sites you should be looking at are those small to medium sites which will deliver relatively quickly. Those are the sites which are going to be needed now and are needed now to meet the needs of people who wish to live in the area. And I hear the local residents saying, well, no one wants them. But in terms of these houses, I would suggest people do want them. The reason the affordability ratio is so extremely high in North Hertfordshire is that there is a great deal of unmet demand, and that's proven by the house prices and the affordability ratio. So let's not kind of fool ourselves by thinking that by undersupplying for a decade, that which has reduced the population, it's reduced, if you like, in-migration. That undersupply should be rewarded by further undersupply in the next 5 years. I just don't think that's the correct way of planning for this nation. And it's clearly not the way that the government is wanting us to plan for this nation, either in 2012 or indeed in 2019. So if one looks at what whether or not there is a 13% buffer, the 13% buffer is not there for the first 5 years. There's no buffer at all. You're not meeting the objectively, you're not meeting the housing requirement in the first 5 years. It's only if, and it's a massive if, all the strategic sites come forward quicker than they have done nationally, at relatively high rates of completions. Now, those are some big ifs, and they're ifs in effectively 2028, 2029, 2030. So a lot can happen between now and then. So the suggestion that you should be looking at removing some of the smaller sites and medium-sized sites that come forward within the next and start making contributions in the next 5 years, because there's a buffer at the end of the plan period, I think is completely it's not understanding, if you like, the trajectory, the council's own trajectory as they put out in the evidence base, and it's, if you like, using the suggestion that there might be a slight oversupply against a very, very reduced number, which has only got a small element uplift for affordability. I think that is clearly misplaced. I also think that the 13%, or 13, 14%, it's at best a couple of years. Now, the truth is, this plan should be planning for 15 years, not the 10 or so it's planning for now. So again, is it really a buffer, or is it actually just planning for 12 years rather than 10? If it's the latter, then quite clearly that's just making the plan more compliant rather than less compliant. So I think that there's, the buffer only exists if all the very positive and optimistic assumptions are correct. If they're incorrect, not only is there no buffer, but you're not even meeting the lower level of housing requirements. So I think there's some very, you have to look very carefully at what you're doing here and make sure that you are not, if you like, effectively producing a plan which bakes in, if you like, consistent undersupply in this area, which is what's happened in the last decade, and makes issues about affordability much worse. I mean, if one looks at just the level of affordable housing that's been delivered, it's extremely low compared to what the councils say they require. So again, that need is now. It's not let's wait another decade before these housing needs are met. They need to be met now, and that's what the government's trying to suggest. And to be honest, they're suggesting it in a different way now, but they're still suggesting it. In 2012, there was still the requirement, if you like, to meet these needs, and they're simply not being met, and they need to be met now. So it means, if you like, if you're looking at sites, those that contribute towards making completions within the first 5 years are ones that obviously need to continue to be supported. Thank you. Okay, that was longer than 4 minutes. I apologise.
Yes, that was 6 minutes. In your view, Mr. Bolton, does the council's commitment to an early review have any effect on the need for a buffer?
I'd put it another way, is why are the council only planning for 10 years anyway? Why aren't they planning for 15? And if they're planning for 15, you wouldn't have a buffer.
Yeah, that wasn't the question I put.
I know it wasn't the question you put, but if you have well, let's put it another way. If you have an early review, that early review will have a higher housing requirement in it, because the government's response to the impact of undersupply is that you have much higher levels of market uplift. So you'll be planning for a higher number in this area. You'll be planning for 15 years. So not only will you need these sites that have been identified, you will need more. So actually, having 13% buffer now brings me back to my point that I made about paragraph 14A of the 2012 framework. It's starting to build in some of the flexibility you most clearly need in this plan.
Okay, one other question while I have you there and before I finish for the day. And if you think this is unfair, then do say. But the council has told me that it is lawful to have a buffer of the magnitude it proposes. Is it also lawful to not have a buffer?
I'm not a lawyer, but I'll have a stab at this.
If it's unfair,
no. I think is it lawful not to have a buffer? Would it be lawful to exactly meet the housing requirement? It would be. I think as long as, let's put it back to you, if you carefully wrote up your final report, yes, it could be lawful. I think you would have to be careful because there's a number of rabbit holes you might fall down, particularly 14A about flexibility. Could you argue that you had flexibility if you merely met the requirement? That would be an interesting way. I'd find that difficult to write, so you might not.
I wonder if a commitment to an early review introduces flexibility.
Well, you could argue that if you're doing an early review, all you need to do is allocate enough sites for the next 5 years. But that's not planning, is it? I mean, let's be quite honest. I myself, like Mr. Griffith there, has had a long experience of planning and strategic planning, and one thinks planning should be for the longer term. If you look at the advice even in the 2012 framework, it says you should plan for 15 years if you can. Now, you clearly can plan for that length of time. It's just that the council have chosen not to. An early review doesn't get you away, I don't think, from the commitments in the 2012 framework. It is, if you like, I'll be quite honest, in this office, we describe it as a get out of jail free card when you know you haven't really got a very good plan and you're not meeting housing requirements, and it's just all a bit too difficult. And therefore you say, well, we'll have an early review, so I don't have to deal with it. It becomes another inspector's job. Now, I don't think it does get you. I don't think it does get you out of looking at what a plan should be doing. I think you need to look at what a plan should be doing, and we've already got compromises here. It's not the length of time it should be. We've argued like yesterday, it's not having the market uplift it should have. So there's a number of things we've said are stacked against this plan. So I don't think an early review would be a reason not to have a buffer.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Bolton. I will let others, and including the lawyers, ponder those two questions that I put to you briefly overnight, because I'm going to now close for the day.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad the lawyers get the warning on that one.
Yeah, are there any questions, or is there anything I need to know about before I do close? Very good. In which case then, it's now 16:37. I adjourn the hearing to resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock on Zoom. Thank you very much.